The gallery was packed, not with just spectators but with eyes sharpened by motive, restless aides, skeptical reporters, and a sea of blinking cameras ready to carve out their sound bites. This wasn't a hearing. It was a theater. It was war, dressed in robes and lined with marble. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the double doors, heels striking the polished floor like a metronome of defiance. Her royal blue suit glowed under the courtroom lights, unbothered, but her jaw clenched with every step. She scanned the room, cold faces, folded arms, Republican operatives in their finest armor, $4,000 suits and thin smiles. Every one of them had a script, and she wasn't written in. High above it all sat Judge Tanya Chutkan, stone still, robe pressed, gaze unreadable. She looked like law itself, but law was never neutral, not here. Not when the gavel was about to fall on a congresswoman of color for doing the one thing this system never forgives, refusing to shrink. This was supposed to be a routine procedural review, a motion to examine alleged decorum violations during an oversight hearing involving Trump-era records, but Jasmine knew what this really was: retaliation, masked in decorum, silence, dressed in protocol. The system was preparing to mute her and call it justice. The gavel cracked once, clean and cold. This session will address procedural misconduct by Congresswoman Crockett, Chutkan said flatly. Counsel, you may present the motion. A Republican lawyer stood quickly, the kind who practiced outrage with a stopwatch. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome was preordained. The record shows a repeated pattern of aggressive and disruptive behavior by the Congresswoman, he said. Most notably during the May 23rd oversight session, we moved to revoke her questioning privileges under Rule 23. Rule 23, weapon so rarely used, even seasoned lawmakers forgot it existed. It allowed the court to silence a member of Congress if they were deemed hostile to the process. It had been dormant for years, until now, until her. Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat still, watching them perform. They weren't trying to prove she was out of line. They were trying to prove she didn't belong in the room at all. Judge Chutkan's voice cut in again, sharp as glass. Congresswoman Crockett, you may respond. I expect clarity, and I expect brevity. Jasmine rose slowly, deliberately. Her palms rested flat on the table, not trembling, not clenched, just steady. They were waiting for fire. She gave them ice. Before I begin, she said, her voice smooth, I'd like clarity. Am I being tried for my words, or for the discomfort they caused? A few gasps. A reporter's pen paused mid-sentence. Chutkan's gaze narrowed. You will address only the motion. Jasmine didn't blink. Then let the record show. I was interrupted twice before completing my first sentence. That's not order, that's orchestration. The words hung heavy in the room. She could feel it now, the structure, the scaffolding. Every part of this hearing had been designed to end her authority without anyone admitting why. But she wasn't going to survive by softening. They didn't come for silence. They came for surrender. So she made a decision. She wouldn't fight them in emotion. She would fight them in precision. If they wanted to drag her through a trial, she would turn their process into a mirror and make them watch what they'd become. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet, but beneath that calm, something was shifting, cracking. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, not yet. She let the silence stretch, let them wonder if she was calculating or combusting, let them wait. Judge Chutkan stared forward, unreadable as ever, but Jasmine saw it, the teeth, tightening of the jaw, the subtle lift of the shoulders. Control, that's what this was always about, not law, not fairness. Control. The GOP counsel smirked slightly, like he'd won already, but Jasmine knew that smirk. She'd seen it before in courtrooms where her clients were set up to fail before they opened their mouths, where prosecutors mispronounced names on purpose and judges looked at black women like they were already guilty of something. She had lived inside that smirk. Judge Chutkan began to speak. This court is not interested in political theater, she said. We are here to enforce the rules of decorum and professionalism, nothing more. Decorum, Professionalism. Jasmine had heard those words her entire career, but only when people like her were speaking. Nobody quoted decorum when Matt Gaetz yelled over witnesses. Nobody pulled out professionalism when Jim Jordan turned hearings into circus acts. No, those rules only rose up like weapons when a black woman raised her voice too sharply or refused to bow. She leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the table, still calm, still composed. "If we're going to discuss decorum, Your Honor," she said evenly, "then we need to be consistent, or we need to admit who these rules are really for." A few seats shifted in the back. The GOP counsel opened his mouth, then thought better of it. But the judge didn't flinch. "This court is not the place for political posturing, Congresswoman." Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. "Neither is the House floor," she said. "But that didn't stop my colleagues from calling me angry when I asked about missing records. And it didn't stop them from filing this motion the moment I mentioned the name Donald Trump." That name. It hit the room like thunder under marble. Judge Chutkan paused, then turned her eyes to the file before her. "You're being reviewed for tone and behavior, not content." Jasmine almost smiled. "I respectfully disagree," she said. "Because if my tone was the issue, we'd be holding this same hearing for 5 of my male colleagues. But we're not. And that's not oversight. That's targeting." Chutkan tapped her pen once, sharply. "Do you wish to continue down this line of argument, Congresswoman?" Jasmine took a breath. Not defiance, not fear, just air, just steel. "Yes, because this is the line they drew when they filed that motion. I'm just walking it." A reporter whispered to another in the back row. A clerk scribbled furiously. Something was happening now. It wasn't obvious yet, but it was real. The weight was shifting. Judge Chutkan set her pen down slowly. Her face was still blank, but in her eyes, something flickered. Not anger, not authority, something closer to uncertainty. And Jasmine knew she had just made the first crack in the gavel. The document slid across the polished table like blades, sharp-edged, pre-written, signed in ink before anyone entered the room. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to read them to know what they said. A motion to revoke her questioning privileges under Rule 23. It sounded clinical, cold, but what it meant was simple. Silence. Not debate, not correction, just erasure. She had seen it before, in smaller rooms under dimmer lights, a slow kill. First they question your tone, then your presence, then your right to speak at all. Judge Chutkan picked up the file, eyes moving over the pages like a machine, efficient, methodical, but Jasmine saw something behind that, distance. Chutkan wasn't doing this for her, she was doing this to protect the process, and Jasmine knew exactly what that meant. The process always had a price, and it was almost never paid by white men in power. The counsel on the opposing side, a man whose name Jasmine hadn't even bothered to remember, stood again, confident. He started citing cases, cherry-picked from dusty corners of House procedure. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. She'd heard that cadence before, the so-and of someone who didn't believe they were lying because they believed the rules bent to their interpretation. "Rule 23 clearly states," he droned, "that a member may be barred from questioning if their conduct undermines the order of the proceedings. Congresswoman Crockett has, on record, interrupted speakers, raised her voice, and shown disregard for the chair's authority." Jasmine didn't flinch. Because that was the trick. Make volume sound like violence. Make assertiveness feel like aggression. Make her existence too loud for their comfort, and call it disorder. She leaned back in her chair, not retreating, studying. Chutkan turned toward her. "Congresswoman, the court needs a fact-based counter-argument to justify denying this motion. Do you intend to offer one?" And there it was, the line, drawn in polished mahogany and protocol. Jasmine nodded once, slowly, deliberately. "Yes," she said. "But I won't just counter it. I'll expose it." The room stirred. A pen tapped twice, a cough somewhere in the back. Even the judge's fingers froze on the edge of her desk. Jasmine reached into her case binder, fingers steady, pulling out a stack of papers marked with yellow tabs. Not emotion, not speech. Receipts. She spoke clearly, voice smooth as glass. In 2006, a congresswoman was nearly sanctioned for behavior nearly identical to what I'm being accused of. That ruling was reversed, on the basis that selective enforcement of decorum standards is unconstitutional when it appears to disproportionately impact minority members. Her eyes met Chutkan's. That precedent is still active. I am invoking it now. The courtroom didn't explode. It cracked. Quietly. Legally. Because what Jasmine had just done wasn't defiant. It was tactical. They expected fire. She gave them a citation. They expected a meltdown. She handed them a ruling. Judge Chutkan blinked, for the first time unsure. And Jasmine Crockett smiled, not with victory, but with readiness. They thought they'd built a trap. She just turned it into a case. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The law, when wielded with precision, was louder than outrage, and that's what she was doing now, weaponizing the very system that tried to silence her. She flipped to the next tab in her binder, her fingertips steady. Yellow, then blue, then green, color-coded like a battlefield map, each one marking a precedent, a rule, a moment in time where someone like her was nearly erased and clawed their way back with nothing but the truth and the law behind them. If Rule 23 is your sword, she said calmly, then Section 302 is my shield. Judge Chutkan's brow furrowed. Section 302 of the House Procedures Manual, Jasmine continued, protects the speech of minority members from targeted enforcement when there is a demonstrable pattern of political or demographic bias. You're not just reviewing my behavior, Your Honor. You're reviewing the pattern of who this court has chosen to silence and who it hasn't. No one moved. Even the court stenographer seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether the moment belonged to history or rebellion. The GOP counsel shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't anticipated this. None of them had. They expected passion. Instead, she gave them architecture, legal scaffolding laid brick by brick, too solid to ignore. Jasmine turned another page. In 2011, a male representative referred to a colleague as a national embarrassment during a live hearing. No motion was filed. In 2015, another congressman shouted over a witness and refused to yield. No motion. But when She paused, just long enough for silence to become tension. When I raise my voice to defend truth, suddenly the integrity of the process is under attack. Judge Chutkan's gaze dropped to the papers in front of her, but it wasn't focus, it was hesitation. Jasmine leaned forward, her tone still measured, almost quiet now. This is not about volume. This is about visibility. You can't punish what you refuse to see, and I will not disappear for your convenience. The courtroom shifted, not with noise, but with gravity. The kind of shift you feel in your chest when something undeniable has just been said out loud. For the first time. Judge Chutkan looked up. For the first time since the hearing began, there was no ruling on her lips. She was calculating, because the argument Jasmine had just laid down wasn't emotional. It was procedural. It was bulletproof. And it put the judge in a corner. To overrule Jasmine now would be to ignore precedent. To ignore precedent would be to expose bias. And that was something even the most powerful gavel couldn't explain away. The trap they set, and the mirror she held up. Jasmine sat motionless, not frozen, but loaded. Like a bow pulled tight, her silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Across the room, the GOP counsel doubled down, his voice louder now, sharp with desperation. He sensed it slipping, the control, the optics, the narrative. He tried to shift the frame back, quickly citing a rule Jasmine hadn't yet addressed. His fingers pointed at her, his words painting her as disruptive, theatrical, unfit for procedural discourse. And that's when Jasmine turned, not to him, but to the gallery. Because this wasn't about law anymore, not just. This was about witnessing. You know what's disruptive? She said, standing slowly. Silencing people while pretending it's order. Her voice didn't rise. It tightened. Every syllable became a scalpel. What you're watching isn't just a legal maneuver, it's a test of how far someone can be pushed before the label of angry replaces the word honest, before a black woman speaking clearly is called combative, before questioning a lie is treated like breaking decorum. She turned back to the judge. You don't have to agree with my tone, Your Honor, but you don't get to erase my place in this chamber because it makes people uncomfortable. Her hands weren't shaking. Her voice didn't crack. It was controlled power, a speech made not to provoke, but to remind. Remind the court, the cameras, and every person watching from home that the system was never built for voices like hers, but she was speaking anyway, not for permission, for record. The judge was still silent. So Jasmine walked forward just a step, enough to shrink the distance, not to threaten, but to confront. Let me be clear. I don't need your permission to belong here. I was elected by Americans, just like everyone else on this panel. I answer to them, not to fear. You could feel it then, the shift, in the air, in the room. Even the GOP aide in the corner, eyes glued to his phone, looked up. Because Jasmine wasn't on trial anymore. The system was. And it was blinking under the spotlight she just flipped on. Judge Chutkan's calm veneer began to crack ever so slightly as the hearing resumed after the brief recess. The courtroom, once filled with hushed whispers, now carried a tangible tension, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The judge, known for her ironclad control, was visibly wrestling with the unprecedented challenge Jasmine had posed. She cleared her throat and addressed Crockett directly, her tone measured but firm. Congresswoman Crockett, do you commit to respecting the court's authority during these proceedings? Jasmine met her gaze steadily. I will respect the law, Your Honor, and I will respect this court. But I cannot, and will not, respect any process that asks me to shrink in its presence. A silence fell, not one of deference, but of reckoning. The judge's fingers hovered briefly over the gavel, weighing power and principle. The GOP counsel shifted uneasily, sensing the tide turning beneath them. For the first time, Judge Chutkan's voice betrayed a trace of frustration. This court is tasked with maintaining order, not engaging in political theater. Jasmine responded, voice calm yet unwavering. Order is meaningless when it becomes a tool to silence uncomfortable truths. The courtroom absorbed her words like a charged current. Even some reporters exchanged looks, sensing the moment was no longer about mere procedure, but a profound clash of power, identity, and justice. Chutkan's next move was subtle but significant, a rare gesture to momentarily suspend the momentum. She called for a short recess to review the materials and consider the legal arguments anew. As the room cleared, whispers floated. Behind the scenes, the judge was grappling with the unyielding facts Jasmine had laid bare. The public eye was no longer just an observer, it had become a judge in its own right. When proceedings resumed, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to cautious respect. Jasmine had not only held her ground, she had unsettled the very foundation of the motion against her. The gavel had not yet fallen, but the balance of power was tilting. The courtroom tension was palpable as the GOP counsel, sensing Judge Chutkan's hesitation, decided to press harder. He rose abruptly, clutching a sheaf of papers, and launched into a pointed attack. Your Honor, Congresswoman Crockett's pattern of hostility is further demonstrated by a statement she made last month, claiming that certain members of this committee are complicit in undermining justice. Such rhetoric is inflammatory and unbecoming. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. This was a calculated move, taking a fragment of her words out of context to portray her as aggressive and unprofessional. But she was ready. Your Honor, Jasmine responded coolly, with your permission, I'd like to enter the full transcript into the record. She slid a printed copy across the table, the pages meticulously highlighted and annotated. As you can see, she continued, the statement was part of a larger argument addressing procedural failures and obstruction. It was not intended as a personal attack, but rather as a critique of systemic issues. Selective quoting distorts the truth. The GOP counsel's confident posture faltered as Jasmine dissected each manipulated phrase with calm precision. One by one, she exposed the distortion, revealing how her words were twisted to fit a predetermined narrative. Judge Chutkan listened intently, her expression unreadable, but her eyes betraying a flicker of concern. The courtroom held its collective breath as Jasmine dismantled the opposition's case, not with passion, but with unassailable logic and evidence. This moment was pivotal. It was no longer just a dispute over decorum, it was an exposure of political tactics weaponizing the rules to suppress dissent. As Jasmine concluded, she looked directly at Judge Chutkan. "Your Honor, the record should reflect that attempts to misrepresent my speech are part of a broader pattern of selective enforcement." For the first time since the hearing began, the judge did not respond immediately. Instead, she silently reviewed the documents, the weight of the revelations settling in the room like a slow, inevitable storm. The GOP counsel sank back into his seat, the confident veneer now visibly cracked. Jasmine's quiet strength had shifted the battle lines. The court was no longer just an arbiter of rules. It was a stage where truth and power collided, and Jasmine Crockett was taking control. Jasmine requested permission to cross-examine the legislative aide who had submitted the complaint alleging her misconduct. A bold move, unconventional but entirely within her rights. The courtroom murmured with surprise, sensing the stakes rising beyond mere procedure into raw confrontation. The aide took the stand, nervous under Jasmine's steady gaze. Jasmine's questions were precise, deliberate, stripping away layers of supposed neutrality. She asked whether similar decorum complaints had ever been filed against prominent GOP members known for far more aggressive, disruptive conduct: Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert. The aide hesitated, then admitted none had been filed. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, voice measured but piercing. "So it's not the words spoken, but the speaker who determines punishment?" A tense silence followed. The courtroom absorbed the implication. Enforcement wasn't impartial, it was weaponized. Judge Chutkan did not interrupt. No objection was raised. The aide's admission laid bare the systemic bias hiding behind procedural jargon, the selective enforcement designed to muzzle dissenting voices, especially those challenging power. Jasmine's cross-examination was more than a legal tactic, it was a public unmasking. With each question, she dismantled the pretense of fairness, exposing the hearing as a tool of political targeting cloaked in legality. When she concluded, the courtroom sat heavy with realization. The rules weren't just broken, they were bent and wielded selectively to silence her. Judge Chutkan's expression was unreadable, but the weight of the testimony lingered. Jasmine had not only defended herself, she'd held up a mirror to the entire system, reflecting its fractures back into the harsh light of day.